For Karoline Leavitt, the invitation to appear on Jimmy Kimmel Live was not entirely unexpected. As a rising voice in conservative politics, Karoline had become a frequent presence in debates and cable interviews. But this was something different. This was late night. Primetime. A stage built more for jokes than substance, for applause than dialogue. Still, Karoline accepted. Not because she needed the attention, but because she believed in speaking directly to audiences who didn't always agree with her. She arrived at the studio in Los Angeles just before 4 p.m. Her team reviewed the segment plan twice. They had been told this would be a conversation about youth and politics, about rising voices, about how the next generation saw the country's future. They were told it would be respectful. A little sparring, maybe, but nothing unfair. Behind the scenes, the mood felt tense. Several members of the production crew avoided eye contact. A few whispered in corners. Karoline noticed, but she didn't let it show. She sat in the green room quietly, reviewing her notes, sipping water, watching as other segments played out on a monitor. Jimmy Kimmel was on form. He joked about the day's headlines, rolled his eyes at politicians, earned laughs with every punchline. But something about his monologue felt more pointed than usual, a little sharper, a little less playful. And then came her name. And later tonight, Kimmel announced to the crowd, "We're joined by Karoline Leavitt." Yes, that one. The internet's favorite spokesperson for yelling at the news. The audience laughed. Karoline didn't smile. She stood, adjusted her blazer, and walked toward the stage entrance when cued. As she stepped out into the lights, the crowd clapped. But it was polite, not warm. There was tension in the room before she said a word. Jimmy stood to greet her. "Karoline," he said with a wide grin. "Thanks for braving our liberal lair." Karoline shook his hand. "Thanks for having me, Jimmy. Always good to find some common ground." The first few questions were as expected. Kimmel asked about her background, her early work, her views on young voters. Karoline answered clearly. She stayed composed, thoughtful, firm. She didn't pander, but she wasn't combative. She was there to speak, not to fight. But Jimmy shifted gears faster than anyone expected. "Now, Karoline," he said, flipping his note cards, "you've been accused of spreading some, let's say, creatively false ideas. Do you really believe what you post, or is this just part of the performance?" The audience laughed, unsure if it was a real question. Karoline blinked once, then answered, "Jimmy, I speak from what I believe. You don't have to agree. But dismissing it as performance is why so many Americans don't trust these conversations anymore." Kimmel smiled, but the edge was clear now. "Well, come on. Some of your tweets are more like declarations of war. You ever think about turning the volume down?" Karoline responded calmly. "I think sometimes clarity sounds loud when the room's used to silence." The studio quieted. The host's grin stiffened. "I just wonder if it's clarity or chaos," he said. "Because there's a difference." Karoline didn't flinch. "Respectfully, Jimmy, I think the audience can decide that for themselves." He looked at the crowd. "They usually do," he said. "But they also know a dodge when they hear one." Karoline leaned forward slightly. "I haven't dodged a single question. You asked, I answered. Just because I'm not playing by your script doesn't mean I'm hiding." The temperature dropped. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Kimmel looked toward the producers off camera and gave a slight nod. The tone had shifted, and it wasn't going back. There was a murmur in the studio. Not the kind of murmur that follows a punchline. The kind that comes when an audience isn't sure whether to laugh or listen. Kimmel, sensing he had lost the rhythm, tried to recover. "So, Karoline, tell me, what's it like being the youngest person in the room and still the most outraged?" The question was delivered like a joke, but it didn't land that way. Karoline paused. Then she answered slowly. "I'm not outraged, Jimmy. I'm passionate. There's a difference. But I understand how it might feel uncomfortable when someone challenges the room." Kimmel chuckled, but there was no humor behind it. "Oh, I'm not uncomfortable," he said. "You're just a lot for prime time, that's all." The audience laughed, but the laughter was thinner now. Karoline kept her tone even. "If honesty feels like too much, maybe it's because we've gotten used to saying nothing." That was the moment the audience fell completely silent. Kimmel leaned back in his chair, clearly irritated. "You know," he said, "we invite people on this show to have a conversation. not to give a sermon. Karoline didn't blink. And I came for that conversation. But if you call it a sermon every time I speak, it's not a conversation anymore, is it? The room was still. Even the band stopped their background cues. A producer offstage gave a cut signal with his hand, but the director didn't call it. The segment was still rolling. Too far and now to backpedal. Too real to pretend. Kimmel shifted in his seat. Look, you've built a whole brand off being controversial. You lean into the outrage, the headlines. Do you really expect people to take you seriously when you show up here and play the victim? Karoline looked at him directly. I didn't ask for sympathy. I asked for civility. And it's revealing that asking for basic fairness gets labeled as playing the victim. There was an audible exhale from someone in the crowd. And then a clap. Just one. Then another. Not loud, not wild, but sincere. Kimmel glanced at the audience, his expression hardening. Well, this is turning into quite the performance, he said tightly. Maybe next time we'll bring a podium. Karoline smiled softly. I didn't come to perform. I came to speak. And you're the one turning disagreement into spectacle. Kimmel looked toward the camera. You hear that, America? This is what happens when politics becomes performance art. Karoline didn't move. This is what happens, she replied, when a guest comes in good faith and gets ambushed for ratings. The sentence hit harder than anything said all night. The studio tensed. A staff member near the stage whispered into a headset. Security was told to stay nearby, not because there was danger, but because control was slipping. Kimmel stood up abruptly, still facing the camera. I think that's enough for tonight, he said. Some guests think this show is about them. It's not. Karoline stood as well, her expression steady. And some hosts forget that respect doesn't have to be earned by agreement. A few audience members applauded again. Others remained silent, uncertain what to make of what they were witnessing. As Karoline turned to walk off stage, Kimmel raised his voice slightly. Let's give her a hand, folks. That was educational. But the applause was forced now. Scattered. And more than a few people in the crowd stayed seated with arms crossed. Backstage, tension hung like smoke. Producers argued in low voices. Staff scrambled to reshuffle the next segment. Kimmel's face was flushed as he walked off set during the commercial break. He removed his mic, not saying a word to anyone. Karoline, still calm, thanked the crew member who walked her to the exit. Karoline walked out of the studio and into the night air without a word to the press. No statement. No rebuttal. Just quiet resolve. Her team followed behind her, silent too, until they reached the car. Inside, someone finally asked if she wanted to release a statement. She shook her head. Not yet. But the statement had already been made. In less than an hour, phone-recorded clips of the segment were circulating online. They showed her responses, unedited. They showed Kimmel's interruptions. They captured the shift in the room when the tone turned from satire to scorn. The official show edit, which aired just 2 hours later, told a different story. Cuts removed key exchanges. The ending was shortened. The confrontation softened. But viewers who had seen the raw footage weren't fooled. What are they hiding? Asked one user on social media. Why cut the one part where she stood her ground? By morning, the internet was on fire. Hashtags surged. Comment sections exploded. Memes were made. But beneath the humor, something deeper had started to surface. It wasn't just about Karoline. It was about trust. About how audiences were no longer willing to accept controlled narratives when they had already seen the truth unfold in real time. It was about the growing gap between public personas and private agendas. The network released a short statement late that afternoon. We regret the tone of last night's segment and recognize that our guest, Karoline Leavitt, deserved a more balanced platform. We are reviewing internal policies to ensure future conversations maintain mutual respect. But it was too late. The apology sounded like protocol, not sincerity. Meanwhile, Karoline still hadn't posted. No threads. No interviews. Just one photo, a still shot of the stage exit door, with a single caption. When the room isn't built for your voice, speak anyway. The image went viral. Not because it was clever, but because it told the truth. And across the industry, people began taking notice. Several hosts privately reached out to her team. Producers from rival shows offered to feature her, not to argue, but to listen. Because whether or not they agreed with her politics, they respected her poise. Behind the scenes, Kimmel's team scrambled. Meetings were called. Staff tensions rose. Some writers questioned the segment's direction. A junior producer reportedly asked, "Did we just prove every point she came here to make?" And then came the ratings. The episode drew attention, yes, but not the kind they wanted. Viewer surveys showed sharp drops in trust. Not in Karoline, but in the host. "We watched someone get talked over for 5 minutes straight," wrote one viewer. And when she didn't lose her cool, they tried to make her leave. Even a few celebrities spoke out. A well-known actress posted, "You don't have to like Karoline Leavitt. But if we start kicking people off for speaking calmly and firmly, then what exactly are we doing on these shows?" As the dust settled, something became clear. Karoline hadn't shouted. She hadn't stormed off. She hadn't played to the crowd. She had stood. She had spoken. And in doing so, she had changed the shape of the conversation, not just about politics, but about what it means to listen when it's difficult, and to stand firm when the room would rather laugh you off stage. In her next public appearance, a university panel about media and messaging, Karoline was asked what she learned from the experience. She smiled. "I learned that silence is powerful when you've said enough, and that dignity under pressure still speaks louder than applause." The room, filled with students from all backgrounds, stayed silent for a moment. Then they clapped. Not for politics, but for clarity. If this story moved you, or made you question what real dialogue should look like, share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe that voice, not volume, is what shapes the future, subscribe. Because the next moment worth watching might not be the loudest one in the room. It might be the one that stood calmly and didn't flinch.